Some marriages are not woven from dreams or born from tender feelings. Some are forged in silence, bound by necessity, sealed with expectations rather than affection. For Helena, this was not a love story, it was a duty she could not escape. The day she stepped into that union, she knew her life had changed forever. Not because her heart had been swept away, but because her freedom had been traded for survival. She became a wife not out of choice, but out of circumstance. And in that moment, she realized she was walking into a cage. A gilded cage, perhaps, but still a cage. There is a special kind of weight that comes with a loveless union. It is not the weight of compromise, which exists in every marriage, nor the weight of shared responsibilities, which can be carried together. It is the weight of emptiness, of knowing that the bond that should bring comfort instead brings isolation. Helena looked at her life and saw the outlines of a story that was never hers to write. She was expected to play a role, smile for appearances, and bury her longings deep inside. The silence of that house was almost unbearable. It echoed with the absence of tenderness, with the knowledge that she was not a partner but an arrangement. The vows they exchanged were words without warmth, promises without passion. And yet, she tried to carry them with dignity, even as the loneliness pressed against her heart. What pained her most was not the lack of luxury, for Dominic provided her with everything material she could want, but the lack of connection. A home can be filled with riches and still feel empty when love is missing. But Helena was not weak. She did not surrender completely to despair. Beneath the sorrow was a quiet strength, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. She told herself that even if this marriage had been born from necessity, she would not allow it to destroy her spirit. She would endure. She would learn, and perhaps, she thought, she would even find some small measure of peace in the life she had been given. Yet in the deepest part of her soul, she longed for more, for love that was real, for a connection that was hers to choose, for a life that did not feel like a sentence handed down by others. The weight of a loveless union is not just about the absence of affection. It is about the absence of self. It demands that you silence your own desires, bury your own dreams, and live according to rules you never made. That was Helena's burden in those early days. And though she did not yet know it, it would be this very weight that would awaken something in her. The courage to seek warmth in a cold place, the determination to fight for her own heart, and the strength to transform her story into something far greater than what it began as. Dominic Marquez was a man whose presence could silence a room. His wealth and power made him untouchable in the eyes of others. But what struck Helena most was not his status. It was his coldness. He carried himself like a fortress, impenetrable and unyielding, as though life had carved away every softness he might once have had. To many, he was admirable. To some, he was intimidating. But to Helena, who had been forced into his world, he was a mystery made of ice. His gaze was sharp but distant, his voice measured and restrained, and his heart seemed buried under layers of frost he refused to melt. To live beside a man like Dominic was to live in the shadow of silence. He did not shout, he did not rage, but his distance spoke louder than words ever could. Every gesture, every interaction, reminded Helena that she was not truly seen. She was part of his life, yes, but only as one might keep a painting on the wall or a piece of furniture in a grand home, present yet unacknowledged. The weight of that detachment pressed on her soul. How do you warm a man who will not let himself feel? How do you reach a heart that has long ago chosen to freeze? And yet, Helena could not help but wonder what had made him this way. No one is born of pure ice. No one begins life without the desire to be loved. Something had shaped him. Something had wounded him deeply enough to convince him that walls were safer than vulnerability. She began to see small signs, faint cracks in his armor, the way his eyes lingered on things he thought no one noticed, the fleeting hesitation in his voice when he almost said something real, the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. They were glimpses, brief and fragile, but they told her that beneath the coldness was a man who still felt, even if he had forgotten how to show it. Dominic's ice was his shield, his survival. To the world, he was untouchable, but Helena was beginning to see that his distance was not cruelty, it was fear. Fear of being hurt, fear of being betrayed, fear of exposing the scars he carried. And while he wore his coldness like armor, it was also his prison. The same walls that protected him also kept him alone, unable to experience the warmth of connection he secretly craved. For Helena, understanding this truth became both a challenge and a calling. She had entered this marriage against her will, believing she was only there to endure, but something in her refused to give up entirely. She wanted to know the man behind the ice, to see him as he truly was, not just as the world perceived him. And though he resisted, though he kept his distance, she began to realize that even the coldest hearts cannot remain untouched forever when warmth is offered with patience. Dominic was a man made of ice, yes, but ice can melt. All it takes is persistence, courage, and the belief that beneath the frozen surface lies something worth saving. Helena did not yet know it, but in trying to reach him, she was not only about to change his life. She was about to change her own. Silence has many forms. Sometimes it is peaceful, a space to rest the soul. Other times it is heavy, a reminder of distance, a wall between two people who cannot find their way to each other. In Helena's marriage, silence was not a comfort, it was a wound that deepened with every passing day. The grand house she lived in echoed not with warmth, but with absence. Even when Dominic was in the same room, his presence felt miles away. The unspoken words between them weighed more than any argument ever could, and for Helena, that silence became the cruelest part of her new life. Yet silence is never truly empty. It reflects back the truths we try to hide. For Helena, the silence reminded her constantly that she was alone, even though she wore the title of wife. It mirrored her own doubts, her fear that she had become invisible in her husband's world, little more than an accessory in his carefully controlled life. Every meal eaten without conversation, every night spent without tenderness, echoed her longing for connection. And in that echo, she began to question not just him, but herself. Who was she becoming in this quiet prison? What parts of her soul were she being forced to bury in order to survive it? For Dominic, silence was his armor. He believed that words could expose him, that opening his mouth might unravel the control he worked so hard to maintain. But silence does not protect forever, it reveals. Helena began to see his silence not as indifference, but as fear. In the long pauses and the unsaid sentences, she sensed grief, scars, and regrets that had shaped him into the man of ice he appeared to be. His silence was a mirror too, reflecting his own battles, his own loneliness, his own inability to trust. And so their marriage became a strange reflection. Her pain mirrored his walls mirrored hers. They were both trapped, both wounded, but neither knew how to break the silence that stood between them. It was a quiet so loud it nearly drowned them. And yet, in its heaviness, something unexpected happened. Silence began to strip away illusions. It left only truth, the truth of her longing, the truth of his fear, the truth that neither of them was as unfeeling as they pretended to be. It was in that silence that Helena made a decision. She would no longer allow it to define her. If words could not come easily, then she would bring warmth through presence, through patience, through persistence. She began to see silence not only as a prison, but as a mirror that showed her the fight she had to wage, not only to reach him, but to rediscover herself. Silence may feel like emptiness, but in truth, it is full of meaning. It reveals wounds, it magnifies longing, and it demands honesty. For Helena and Dominic, silence was the battlefield on which their hearts first began to confront each other. And though it hurt, though it isolated, it was also the first step toward breaking the walls that had kept them apart. Even the strongest walls eventually begin to crack. For all of Dominic's coldness, his carefully constructed armor was not indestructible. It had been built over years of pain, disappointment, and loss, but Helena's presence in his life began to test it in ways he had never expected. At first, he resisted her warmth, meeting every attempt at kindness with indifference. He thought distance was safety, that silence was strength. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to form in the icy fortress he had built around his heart. It happened in fleeting moments. A glance that lingered too long, a hesitation in his voice, a rare softness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Helena noticed these small shifts. To most, they would have gone unseen, but she was searching, desperate for any sign that her husband was more than the cold exterior he showed the world. And in those brief glimpses, she saw proof that he was still human, still capable of feeling, even if he fought to bury it. The cracks deepened when he let slip fragments of his past, stories he had never intended to share. They were never told fully, never confessed openly, but in half-finished sentences and abrupt silences, Helena pieced together the truth. This was not a man born of ice, but a man who had been taught by heartbreak that love was dangerous. His arrogance was not pride, but protection. His distance was not cruelty, but fear. The more she saw, the more she understood that his armor was less about keeping others out and more about keeping himself from breaking. For Helena, these cracks were not just revelations about him, they were invitations. Each glimpse of vulnerability gave her hope that there was a path forward, that beneath the coldness was a heart waiting to be reached. She began to push gently against his walls, not with force but with persistence. She showed him patience when he expected anger, compassion when he expected resentment, loyalty when he expected abandonment. Little by little, her quiet strength wore away at his defenses, proving that not everyone would hurt him, not everyone would walk away. And as those cracks widened, Dominic began to change. He found himself speaking words he had once swallowed, sharing moments of honesty he thought he would never reveal. He was still guarded, still reluctant, but in Helena's presence, he began to lower the shield. The fortress he had lived in for so long no longer felt like protection. It felt like prison. And for the first time, he wanted out. Cracks in armor are not weaknesses, they are the beginnings of healing. They allow light to enter the darkness, warmth to melt the ice, love to seep into places it was once shut out. For Dominic, those cracks were terrifying, but they were also liberating. And for Helena, they were proof that her fight was not in vain. The coldest heart, no matter how frozen, cannot resist forever when someone is brave enough to bring warmth again. In the beginning, Helena thought her role was only to survive, to endure a marriage built on necessity rather than choice. She believed she had entered a life where love was impossible, where her identity would be overshadowed by duty, where she would slowly fade into silence. But as time passed, she realized something extraordinary. In trying to bring warmth to a cold man and a colder marriage, she was not only changing him, she was changing herself. Love, in its raw and unexpected form, became the mirror in which she discovered her own strength, dignity, and courage. Helena had entered the union feeling powerless, convinced she was trapped in a story she did not write. Yet every act of patience, every choice to see beyond Dominic's walls, was a declaration of her own resilience. She began to understand that her worth was not defined by circumstance, but by how she responded to it. In facing his distance, she discovered her persistence. In facing his silence, she discovered her voice. In facing his coldness, she discovered the depth of her own warmth. The marriage that seemed like a sacrifice began to reveal itself as a journey of self-discovery. Love has a way of awakening parts of us we never knew were asleep. Helena's attempts to reach Dominic were not just about saving him. They were about saving herself from despair. With every small victory, a moment of honesty from him, a shared glance, a rare smile, she felt herself grow braver. She began to reclaim the pieces of her identity that fear and obligation had tried to strip away. She was not just a woman surviving a loveless union. She was a woman learning the power of love to heal, to endure, and to transform. What surprised her most was how love redefined her sense of freedom. At first, she thought freedom meant escape, running from the life she had been forced into. But in discovering love, she found freedom within herself. It was the freedom to forgive without losing dignity, to care without losing strength, to hope without losing realism. It was the realization that true freedom does not come from changing circumstances, but from awakening the heart within them. And through this journey, Helena discovered something even more profound. Love was not weakness, as Dominic had once believed. Love was power. The power to melt walls of ice, the power to endure silence without breaking, the power to transform despair into hope. By loving, she became stronger, not smaller. By choosing compassion, she became freer, not bound. And in helping Dominic rediscover his humanity, she uncovered the full measure of her own. In the end, what began as a marriage of sacrifice became the canvas on which Helena painted her true self. She thought she had been brought into his life to save him. But in truth, she had been brought there to find herself. Love did not just awaken a man made of ice. It awakened a woman who had been forced into silence, showing her that her heart, once tested, was capable of changing everything.